Hey, hey, hey! Welcome to the Beyond the Prophy podcast. I am your host, Jasmine Haley, founder of Beyond the Prophy, and today's guest is Jonathan Bonnano. I am very excited to have him a part of our discussion today. He is a new member of the Beyond the Prophy community. Jonathan Bonnano is a pioneering figure in recruitment process outsourcing (RPO) solutions for dental service organizations and emerging groups. With over a decade of experience in healthcare and on the verge of completing a doctoral degree in industrial organization psychology, Jonathan is committed to improving workforce performance and driving organizational success. Jonathan's mission is to empower healthcare professionals to build resilient, high performing, and psychologically safe teams. So I want to welcome you to the show today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I feel like I get to be a little fangirl for a moment.
Well, it's awesome. I'm so glad we connected. We connected on the Smiles and Sea. So shout out to Elijah Desmond, who creates and curates these amazing experiences on cruises. So we had the opportunity to meet, and I just really love your mission and everything that you are doing with your company. So I thought that this would be when you submitted your information. I was like, yes, let's go. Like share your brilliant work. So let's just dive
Thank
right
you.
in. You're a psychologist, you're in dentistry specifically. I want to know how those two forces merge together for you in your professional career.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first started out inside of my really career planning portion of my life, when you're 16, 17 years old and your career counselor comes in and says, all right, plan your life. I was going the direction to become a plastic surgeon. I started doing all of my prerequisite courses by my sophomore year of high school. And then I became a certified nursing assistant by my senior year. I really just kind of fell into the clinical side to quickly realize that I had no interest in being clinical. I'm not somebody that can handle the smells, blood, odors, none of that stuff. I have a bunch of tattoos, but I also hate needles. So figured that probably wouldn't be the best route to take as a plastic surgeon if I couldn't even stomach what I'd have to experience.
Right.
So I took a step back from school. I went more of the business route of healthcare and started working within corporate centers, whether it was in the med surg space, pharmaceuticals, copay assistance programs. Then merged into more of the business analysis side, where I was launching, deploying, and staffing more of the systems and structures for these like copay programs that we would initiate and implement once the FDA released a new medication. And it was that moment actually where not only was I presented the opportunity to join the world of dentistry, I was also starting to look at, okay, I'm already in like heavy project management and implementation space. I'm already moving people in this realm, but I'm not getting the desired outcome that I might have. I mean, I was young at the time that I really joined that arena, if you will. I was 20 by the time I hit my first leadership role in those conversations. So it was
Mm,
very new. It was very
yeah.
foreign. It was very much the who's this young kid telling me what to do? And me being the young kid leading the project, telling people what to do, I started looking at it from the realms of, well, how do I be more people focused and people centered rather than so project focused and project centered? Meaning, I know that there's a timeline, there's a budget that I have to meet and stay within, but how can I do a better job of doing that when I have the people motivated around me to support that end outcome?
Mm,
So while I was making that transition into dentistry, I was also making that internal transition from looking at how am I operating with people in my day to day. And
mm,
that's where I really found an interest in the psychology of it all. My undergraduate and my graduate are both more focused on business administration and business management. But again, that doesn't really touch or really even scratch the surface of how you really inspire and understand what's going on with people. That's where we get to dive into like the mental health constructs of it all. And
mm-hmm.
it just opened up a wedge for me. And that's where I fell in love with it, is how do we make sure that the people that we're supporting other people feel supported still too?
Yeah, yeah. So for those listeners who may not have had, because obviously I know the terms of psychological safety. We actually talk about it. I feel like more extensively outside of dentistry. I've
Mm.
heard that specific term more than anything, but I would love for you to kind of define that for people who are listening, who may be hearing that for the first time, who may not understand exactly. They may have felt it, they may have dealt
Yeah.
with circumstances, but they never really have been able to put a label to it. Can you just describe what exactly that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in a nutshell, psychological safety, when it is present, it is a culture of rewarded vulnerability, meaning I can show up to be my authentic self, whether that's super high Jonathan and he's showing up in his leopard spots, or he's a little bit more introverted and reserved and he needs somebody to poke out some of those spots that I might be missing that day. That's where we
Mm,
start creating that level of camaraderie and understanding. Psychological safety really stems from the level of trust that you want to have enveloped and developed amongst your organization. So, what are you doing to really create that as the foundation for cultural awareness and cultural understanding to be developed? As you
mhm,
mentioned, psychological safety is not commonly spoken about within dentistry. It is a discussion beyond it. And it's great that now it's happening and taking place. I think my essence from it and the angle that I play from it is let's make sure it's not a buzzword. So in order to make psychological safety present, you prioritize it. And it talks about being vulnerable. So if I'm coming to you, Jasmine, saying, "Hey, Jasmine, we had a really great huddle yesterday. There was an opportunity inside of where I think you could have led the conversation a little better. Are you open to some feedback?" Hey, JB, yeah, sure. I'm happy
mm,
to have the conversation. Let's talk about it. Okay, great. Here's where you did this like amazingly and beautifully, right? It's almost like the feedback sandwich starts bubbling into it. But it has
mhm.
to start with, do I even have your listening right now? Do we have a
Yeah.
level of connection? Do you trust what I'm going to say is in the essence of support and love and affinity, not from the essence of I'm breaking you down because these were your opportunities?
Yeah. And it's so needed. It's so needed because when we're in school, I've had experience as a clinician, as a dental assistant, as a hygienist, as a faculty member in academia. I'm an entrepreneur now. Um, in our education, there is no time spent on really the personal development journey we need to go through before we start working with the public.
Yeah,
We're so focused in on making sure we pass our boards, which is understandable. It's a lot of information that has to be covered in a short period of time. So when
right.
you're thinking about, culture, because what you're describing is really a culture of a practice, and thinking about psychological safety and the work that you do to help other teams be able to develop that, what would you say is like one of the first steps for those someone individually? Because I feel that for me personally, the first step was working on myself.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that made it a little bit easier. So I would love to know from your psychology background, what does that look like?
Yeah, that is such a great position to operate from and space to create from too. When I start thinking about the individual representation and the person and human that we are in the space that we want to build or walk into, right? It starts with us. You are completely spot on. So when we start looking at creating a psychologically safe environment, it starts with us inserting that level of safety and trust. And that starts with just being open. And as weird as that might sound, it's being open to the fact that there's going to be an exchange of ideas, and not all of them I'm going to be able to agree with. So, what am I going to be able to do with the energy that then heightens or lowers during those conversations?
Mhm,
So, when I'm looking at it from an individual basis, I'm going to look at it as to be as my authentic whole self as much as I can be. But I'm going to be mindful of the energy and the environments that I'm also walking into. So, if I'm working with a team that's maybe just had a complete breakdown. There's a lack of camaraderie. There's nothing but conflict. There's not a lot of synergy. Maybe there was just a buyout that happened and then there's new team members in. Well, the way that I like to phrase that is, have you ever been to a family reunion and you stick out like a sore thumb because you don't know that you had this many family members and you don't know who to
mhm,
talk to because you don't see like your cousins that you go and hang out with, right?
mhm,
That's kind of the same feeling that ends up happening when we're introducing new ideas, new concepts, new team members into something that's very established. What are we now having to figure out
mhm,
and do? So, when we start thinking about psychological safety from an individual basis, it's coming in with that openness. It's coming in with the idea of I'm going to be able to be curious and I'm going to be willing to have a conversation with those that are around me, even in
mhm,
sight or in light of those disagreements and those breakdowns. Part of the psychological safety conversation also is there sometimes becomes a misconstrued understanding that it's something where everybody needs to get along and agree to, and that is where everyone should be kumbayaing from, that's not the healthy cycle or side of really creating the culture of a dynamic ability or thriving capabilities or growth and development, right? Like, you have to be willing to challenge some of the status quo. You have to be willing to get into the conversations and lean into them, even if they're super uncomfortable. So
Mhm.
when we want to create that psychological safety, it starts with us. We have to identify what safety really looks like for us too. Is it in way of being? Is it a level of feeling? Is it how we're conversing, communicating? It really has to be the layers in which you want to peel back from to really peel it back to the direction you want to go.
Yeah. I love that. I really, really love that. And I do feel like I have to be honest, most folks don't like sitting with themselves. If you have to get quiet and really get introspective and think about the way that you view the world and think people want to avoid that. They'll do everything else but actually sit with themselves. And it just sounds like, that awareness piece is super huge. But I would love to know, like, I'm sure the listeners get it. Like, yes, most everybody that listen are purpose driven, heart driven folks, and so
Yeah.
we're always touching in with the internal side of us. But I would love to know, like, what have you seen as far as pushback? What are some of the challenges that dentistry specifically is facing with this? Because I understand the importance of it, but I'm sure there has to be some hoops or maybe barriers, I'll use that word, that we kind of have to push through.
Yeah, I would say the biggest barrier and the biggest issue inside of really instilling the psychological safety conversation is that there is no lack or is a complete lack of trust. There's no form of trust being present amongst the team to even have a
Mm.
conversation.
Ooh, that's
So
big.
yeah, and that's usually where I find the biggest holes, and that ends up being the biggest hole that I'm working my way out of, because
Mm.
that's the hardest part. I mean, walking into an office, maybe it's a new team member that has joined, and there's a team that's sitting around in the lunchroom. This team member walks in, this entire team gets up and walks out and leaves that person there. There's a
Mhm.
level of trust that's not present. And that could be whether there's no form of camaraderie, there's no form of level of engagement. Maybe team members are disengaged and operating in silos. So
Mhm.
when you become aware of it, because awareness is the key to it all, are you creating trust? Are you interested in developing trust with one another? And it's
Mhm.
not just trust in language, it's again trust in actions. So what are people doing if I'm going and leaving a scalar on one of my mats and it happens to fall and I'm running to the left to go to the next operatory? Who's coming in behind me to help grab that scalar? Right,
Mhm.
it's the unexpected expectations that end up showing up when we have trust present. And when you have that, I find that teams are much more open to have now those conversations of, okay, now that's not working. We're having this many drop offs on our hygiene schedule. This is what we should be doing. Oh, no, this is what we always do. So just keep doing it. Well,
Mhm.
that gets pushed under the rug. The moment that it becomes present and trust is present, we can say, hey, no, actually, we've tried it that a little too long now. Let's try a different approach and different method because this has been our approach we've been using for 9 years. Now let's try something else for the next 9 days. Doesn't work?
Mhm.
Great. At least we can say it didn't work. But then it goes back to not deflating that person inside of what they're sharing. Okay, great. There has to be some success in the last 9 years there. But what other success can we get from this? How do we go from good to great? You can't have those conversations if you're just in the way of, or excuse me, you can't have those conversations if you're just in the immediate like idea and solution sharing because then
Yeah.
nobody's really listening. They're just listening to respond.
Exactly. Exactly. So for you specifically, this is your expertise, this is your what you're passionate about. I would love to know what you're specifically doing to help individuals, teams, or leaders to be able to create a safe space. What does that look like for how you're creating this new movement?
Yeah. And thank you for asking that question. And I'm going to take it back to your first comment, which is it starts with us. So
Mhm.
I used to be somebody that was on a team. My first leadership role was 20. My first senior leadership role was 23. I was very young, thrown into at times the wolf den. And, you learn to deal with it and you grow up really quickly. But it started when I stepped into my first leadership role and I recognized the type of leader that I didn't want to be, the type of team that I
Mm,
didn't want to be on, and the type of culture that was created around me.
yeah.
And I've really taken that not for granted. I'm a thinker, so at times I dwell on things that I maybe shouldn't for too long.
Mhm.
And those are areas that I would go back to commonly and look at, like, okay, what was I doing back then that wasn't producing the outcome I was looking for? What type of relationships was I having with people? What type of conversations was I having with my leaders or even myself and my peers?
Mhm.
And that's where I knew that I needed to make a change for what I wanted to be able to leave a footprint on.
Mm.
So it started with me. It started with a lot of the intrinsic thinking. It started with, okay, if I'm coming into a space, what's that perception? What's the feel? If I'm coming in, like, I'm giving fist bumps and high fives and knuckles to everybody because that's just what I like to do. It's a way of acknowledging everyone around you. It's making sure that everyone feels seen, it feels heard, feels represented, just in those minute actions. So taking on those little, I would say, gentle reminders for myself was the first portion of what's the space you want to be responsible for creating, whether it's amazing and there's just a
Mhm.
couple things to tweak, or there's some really big work to be done.
Yeah.
It started with me looking back at the energy, the conversations, my mental health, my
Yeah.
headspace, because it's not effective for me to go into a space or an environment where they're expecting me to be on or present, and I'm really operating from about like 20%. And
Mhm.
that's not really helpful either way.
Yeah.
So inside of that, I then developed what I call the lab methodology, and it is where we learn, assess, and build. It's really from a state of observation. I'm very introverted. I'm an extroverted introvert in many regards, and I think a lot. So I like to go into more of an observing state, and then I will identify, okay, here's where some of our strong suits are. Sounds pretty routine, pretty basic as far as an exam goes, but it lets me kind of put myself in the passenger seat while everybody else is driving. And now I can say, all right, I'm coming in to press the brake here, or we're going to speed up here. Almost like the secondary driving advisor. That's the
Mhm.
role that I'll take on.
Mhm. So I'm curious, like, if you're not in a management position and you happen to be more of a support auxiliary role, like, how can you even introduce to if it's a dental team specifically, that this is the next thing that we should be working towards?
Absolutely. The one thing that I love to say when it comes to how it flows is how we create the flow. It's not a top down approach and it's not a bottoms up. It is happening everywhere in between and in the middle. So that
Mhm.
means if I am a front office coordinator and I'm coming in and I just heard this podcast and I'm like, hey, Doc, let's talk
Mhm.
about psychological safety. Have you heard of it before? No, I
Mhm.
haven't. What did you hear? Well, here's some things that I'd love for us to consider. I'd love for us to have a little bit more team camaraderie outside of the office. Can we do like a quarterly event and we just go smash a bunch of glass stuff at a smash room? Like, how
Yeah.
can we have some engagement? It's very, very simple of just asking the right questions. And it's about asking, right? Elijah says the thing about closed mouths don't get fed. Same
Mhm.
concept shows up here. We have to make sure that there is a conversation taking place. So even as a contributor, auxiliary role, you're able to be the change agent for the space that you are inhabiting too. You're, whether leadership's in your title or not, you have your own voice, you have your own skill set, you have the power to create the lead and cause the change if that's what your intentions are.
Mm.
So comes from the intentions too. Are you bringing up psychological safety in a way of identifying that we don't have a safe environment? So it becomes a form of attacking and blaming? Or are you coming at from a solution orientation? Hey,
Yeah.
we're not seeing eye to eye. And I want to see eye to eye because I know this team is great and I love working here and I love our patients.
Yeah.
Great. Let's figure out how we do it. There's
Yeah.
no right or wrong way to create that level of safety and trust. The most important thing is that it's present.
Mhm. I really love the example you gave at the outset of that answer, where it was more focused on, "Hey, have you heard of this term?" I think it would be great if we can kind of build more camaraderie, because our initial reaction, which we often see in the dental forums, online, in various groups, is to complain and to start with the negative part. And there was two instances, two examples you gave where we started off with more of a positive approach to something without finger pointing. So it was like the feedback one where you gave like, hey, these are the points that I appreciate. Would you be open with feedback? Then you gave the second example, which was more of, hey, have you heard of this term? Now, of course, they may have heard of it, but
Yeah.
you're lighting it up. You're removing any defense mechanisms that someone may come up with that will definitely not actively listen to what you have to say if your approach is off. So I love how you
Absolutely.
just demonstrated that to help us see that, one of the key ways in which we can start creating more of a psychologically safe environment is just working on our own communication skills and how we're approaching. And possibly for me, I've had to regulate myself. Sometimes it's not a good time to have the
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
don't
I'm
have to
not in
walk
a good
away.
mood.
Right.
Yeah, I'm not in a good mood. I'm not ready for feedback. Otherwise, you're gonna have some too, right? Like
Right.
it's funny. It gets us out of our own space, and I think the most daunting thing that ends up showing up about it is the psychology concept of it all, because it
Yeah.
creates it like, oh, they're gonna get in my head. No, no, no. We want you to get in your head.
Yeah.
Here's what you can do to start solving for whatever those hurdles, roadblocks are that maybe are created or fictitious.
Yeah, that's so good. I love that. Get in your own head. Get in your own head. Because
Yeah.
when we work on ourselves, it brings you more peace. Your even your life, just every interaction will just show up differently. I've just noticed that
Yeah.
for myself, the shifts in my personal life and in my professional life just because of the work that I've done within myself. There are times though that you may have to exit stage left. We're not going to deny that, right? But there is always still room for a team to grow and a faculty body to grow,
Yeah.
where everyone feels psychologically safe. Everyone is able to thrive in their work environment.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. We spend so much time, whether it's at home at our desks or at a desk at another location. Let's enjoy our time there.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So if others are looking to take a deeper dive in creating a psychologically safe environment in their workplace, how do they get in touch with you? Where do they find more information to learn about your lab methodology?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're on all the social media platforms. Our handle is at Talent by Zia. Our company is called Zia. We focus on talent in motion for virtual and on-site integration. So that is where we start the foundation for creating psychological safety. Whether you're ready to hire or bring on new talent, we want to make sure that we're bringing talent that can stay and grow. So having the conversation of psychological safety is very, very first inside of our discovery approach. So that way we know where we're sending our people to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. All right. Here's my last question. I would love to know, we can go back to Jonathan at the beginning of his leadership journey. What is one piece of advice you would give yourself?
Uh, this has been my common thread the last few days, which is the power of the pause. I
Mm,
was thrown into, I wasn't thrown into, I was promoted into opportunities that I asked for. I
mm,
was never fully mentally ready for
mm,
them, and I was rushing through them. And
mm,
now, as I look back almost 10 years ago, there were a lot of moments that I felt like I could have sat with, processed more, grown from, versus experience it for what it was and move on to the next experience to encounter. So
mm.
enjoy it.
I love that. Power of the pause. All right, y'all. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for sharing your expertise and also being willing to come here on the show. I've thoroughly enjoyed learning from you, and I highly encourage each of the listeners, if you're looking to work on that psychological safety, we all know that we need it. We don't want to get burnt out. We want to be able to serve our communities and be able to do so with excellence. Please reach out to Jonathan, and thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Jasmine. Thank you so much. Appreciate you.